Hello, my name is Owen Rooks, and this is my presentation on the Battle of the Somme for History 102 W01X Winter 2021 for Professor George Maniatis of MCC, Muskegon Community College. The first image that we see right on the title screen here is a German soldier wandering the ruins of a destroyed town on the Somme after the Battle of the Somme. The Somme itself is this large highlighted red box. It's a river running through northeast France. And it's a relatively peaceful place, too. It's always kind of tranquil. However, in the coming months of the onslaught of the war, it would find itself the bloodiest place in British history. Here are some photos of the Somme. This one in the top left is a photo taken, an aerial, before the battle, 1916 about. I am unsure of the actual date on that photo. The one in the bottom left is of a similar area, a wider part of the Somme that was most likely not affected during the battle. However, this one on the right is, I believe, of Péronne, modern day, which was the city we saw in the title slide. And again, this is just a very peaceful photo of the Somme, modern day. And this is what it would come to look like after the battle. Just absolutely devastated. No trees standing, holes everywhere from shells or trenches dug. Just miserable. The area would be absolutely devastated by prolonged trench warfare and just endless artillery barrages. There was no tree that was left standing or unscathed in any form. They were absolutely rooted or just debarked and totally had all the branches tore off of them. The ground, which was once grass and a nice river, just became mud puddles and dirt, just overturned dirt. And you can see in this one on the bottom right, if you look at the bottom of the photo, there are some wood, which suggests there was a building there maybe at one point. The build up to the Somme. The Great War had already been raging for 2 years. The war started in 1914, and at this time it's 1916. The battle was supposed to have a lot more French support than it did. However, the French had been pulled away to Verdun. The Germans had just invaded Verdun, and the French were going to counterattack them there. So it became mostly a British backed endeavor. However, the French were still present, just in much less numbers. It was seen as a quicker way of victory for the Allies. This could be a counterattack against a place that the Germans were not necessarily prepared, nor they believed they could get through easier here. However, the plans had fallen into enemy hands. Two troops were captured by the Germans and interrogated and given out the plans to the Germans. This photo in the bottom right here is Indian cavalry of the British Army. There were other forces present, of course, at the Battle of the Somme. There were Canadian, Irish, Scottish, not just British or French, but there were other forces. The next few slides are going to be over equipment used by each side during the war. And obviously none of this looks like anything we would use modern day. It's all very dated. This obviously isn't all what a British soldier would carry. There are a few variables here. Not every soldier was issued a pair of these right here are wire clippers that you could attach to the end of your rifle. Obviously, not every soldier was issued that. That is mostly an experimental thing. However, you will notice one of the biggest things to pull away from this is the ammunition for the rifle. Modern days, we have what are called magazines. These big 30 round box mags that are detached from a gun, and they're much quicker to reload. These are what are called stripper clips. Stripper clips hold about 5 to 10 rounds of ammunition, and this gun here is an SMLE. I am unsure of the mark. It is Mark 1 through I think 5. However, the SMLE only holds about 10 rounds. Modern guns hold about 30, 20 to 30. And this gun is only bolt action, which means you have to cock it every time before you fire. So it's a big difference in what we would do today and how we would think today in terms of fighting. With stuff like this, you're going to do more so volleys or more so concentrated fire. You're going to have 100 men spread over a line who are all going to shoot relatively quickly to compensate for the fact that you don't have a bunch of fully automatic guns or guns with large magazines that are semi-automatic. This hood up here is a gas attack hood. This is a very early version of basically a gas mask, and it was impregnated with a chemical agent that would neutralize chlorine gas, phosgene gas, or any other gas that would you may come into contact on the battlefield. You would just basically throw it over your head and tuck it into your collar. Very rudimentary. A child could use it. You'll notice down here these long sticks with spikes and a weight at the end. These are clubs. World War One wasn't clean. You're getting into a trench, you're gonna get dirty, you're gonna run out of ammo. You've got to find a way to fight someone with more than just your bare fists. Most trench clubs were homemade, as in made in the trench with what they could find, as they weren't necessarily issued with anyone. They're not standard regulation by any means. And another thing to go along with that is this giant bayonet, which you will not see on almost any gun nowadays. And here's some examples of what the units would look like wearing this. This man in the front is an officer holding a training rifle. You can tell he doesn't have any like garb on that would carry ammunition for him or anything. Mm. This guy in the back is an infantryman on the right. He's got plenty of pockets for ammunition. And this guy on the left, he has this big leather jacket on. Now, I don't know if he's an infantryman or a machine gunner. However, those jackets were more so given to machine gunners, so he most likely got it off of a machine gunner or is a machine gunner. And those were issued to them because they would stop more debris from getting through and hurting the wearer. Here we can see the French. The French are in the same boat as the British, and this image is, again, not everything in this image would be issued to a basic French infantryman. They're not going to give them 2 canteens, 6 different kinds of grenades. One looks homemade, even. And a cane and a pipe. That's not all going to be issued. That's something one of them might have on them. You'll notice a few big differences are the rifle, of course. They're not using the same kind of rifle. They're using a Lebel rifle, which uses end block clips compared to stripper clips. End block clips just contain the ammunition within the rifle. A stripper clip you throw away after you put it in. One of the things that the French get a lot of credit for is designing and mass producing the first helmet to be used. The helmet that this gentleman on our left is wearing, and up here next to this rucksack, is an Adrian helmet, and that would be, again, the first mass-produced helmet. Prior to this, you can see the Germans are in the center here. They're wearing a quote-unquote helmet, and that helmet is all made of leather. It's not going to stop really much, and you can see that everyone else here, the British and Americans, wore very similar stuff, so I kind of grouped them together on the left, and on the right we have the French. Also, you'll notice the French have these bright red pants that will lead to a lot of issues, and they changed that very quickly in 1916. Uh, they they go to more of a sky blue color with the pants, like the jacket. But you'll notice no one here is wearing helmets, like actual helmets, metal helmets. And that's because they were mostly for show at that time if they were around. Um, there was no need to really protect from a bunch of debris before this war. So you'll notice the helmet covers the wearer's head, just mostly the top. And it's made so that not to stop like a bullet or anything, that's going to go right through it. It's made to mostly stop debris falling when you're sitting in the trench. Debris is going to fall on your head, obviously, if you're in an artillery barrage. and you don't want it to hurt your head. So say a big chunk of like concrete gets thrown into the air. I don't think you want that coming down onto your head with nothing on your head to help you. So the French get that prize and they go on to make their own helmets. You can see here again a gas mask in the bottom left in a tin this time. The last one was just a hood you kind of threw in a bag. This one's in a tin. You could sling it over your shoulder, put it on your kit, wherever. However, it sat on only the face. It was just a face mask. It's much more advanced to say than the British one we just looked at. That was like a first stopgap kind of thing. This one has an actual filter in it and will stop more, but again, nothing's foolproof. Here are the Germans. The Germans, again, are in the same boat. However, you will notice that they have in the top right, the helmet has some very interesting camouflage on it. The Germans, because the helmets were somewhat reflective, were given orders to paint on their own camouflage to their helmets. So, in a lot of images, you will see that. The Germans had just switched helmets too. Prior, they were using leather ones, which wouldn't really constitute a helmet. So that's why the French get the prize for being the first to develop a helmet. And you can see this is again mostly the same. There's a lot less here, but this is more so what would be issued. Again, not three types of grenade and a flare pistol to everyone. The Germans were also using a rifle that used stripper clips. Like everyone else at the time, were using bolt action rifles that held about 5 rounds. You've got to really fill a trench with men to have sustained fire like you would nowadays with one guy and a rifle. You can see another gas mask here on the right portion of the screen. The Germans were the first ones to use any form of gas in the form of mustard gas, and they were the ones who were the most forward with their gas masks at the time. Our man on the left here is sporting a very fashionable German outfit of 1916. There's a lot less going on with it. He doesn't have a full kit on, so you can assume he is probably more stationary or a behind the lines troop. He is not prepared with any extra ammunition on him, it appears. Now, while the French may have gotten the recognition for designing the first helmet and mass producing it, the Germans go on to pioneer it. They would really make the most effective helmet of the war. And if you go through and look at a lot of helmet designs nowadays and related ones, you'll notice a lot of them follow kind of a similar pattern. The Stahlhelm, which is the 1916 pattern Stahlhelm, was made to protect as much of the wearer's head and neck as possible, while also maximizing the amount of vision and hearing possible. In preparation for the Battle of the Somme, the British shelled the Somme, the area around the Somme, the cities and German positions. They shelled the Somme for about a week with over 1.5 million shells of high explosive artillery shells. However, it failed. They didn't achieve the success that they wanted to. Most German positions were still fortified. Most German positions were still intact. They were still unscathed. All the barbed wire the Germans had laid, most of it anyway, was still intact. Now, the fact that they missed all this barbed wire and all of the fortifications would be a huge problem. This would come back to really, really mess up the plan that the British and the French had to attack the German positions, and it would slow them down a considerable amount and would really lead to a slim victory on the first day. And this photo on the left here is just an absolute hill, a mountain of spent artillery casings. Just when 1.5 million shells are fired, you've got to think that there's hills like this all behind the artillery lines. This has to be 50,000 shells. But again, we're talking 1.5 million. On the 1st of July, 1916, the British launched their attack. About 100,000 Allied units, mostly British, are involved. They go over the top of their trenches and go to attack the Germans. 58,000 of them, over half of them, are killed or wounded. And this is due to that failed bombardment. They were slowed down to the point of almost a crawl by the barbed wire, and they were made easy targets for the machine guns of the German positions. 19,240 British men were killed. This has been looked at as the deadliest day in British military history. The highest losses they have ever seen. And for all this, only about 10,000 Germans were lost, wounded and killed. Over half of the men the British sent died or were wounded. Over half. That's enough to almost be a small village at that time. Even though the Allies, the French and the British, had lost over half of their men, namely the British, the battle was a success. They were able to push the Germans back over the River Somme and able to get a small foothold in the area that they will constantly fight over for the next 140 days, almost 5 months of just brutal fighting. You'll see this on the right here. This is a photo of two German prisoners, stripped of all their gear, weapons. All they've got left is their helmets and the clothes, carrying a wounded British soldier. Over the next few days, several ceasefires would be negotiated between the French, British, and the Germans to retrieve the wounded and the bodies of the dead. Given that over half of the British forces were wounded and dead, a good amount of them were missing in the fields and they had to go retrieve them. In the photo on the screen, you can see multiple German prisoners being escorted by the British. Right in the center of the photo, you can see two German soldiers, prisoners, one of them with a Red Cross armband, presumably he's a medic, or was, carrying a wounded British soldier who evidently can't walk. So you can only imagine he's pretty hurt. His legs have to be messed up in some form. The big thing about the Battle of the Somme is it's the first battle to ever involve tanks. What you see on the screen right now is the British Mark I tank. Obviously, this looks nothing like any modern tank you can think of, and is a far cry from anything. The Battle of the Somme will see the first use of tanks in 1916. The British knew that they needed something to break what would be a coming stalemate at the Somme. Well, not specifically at the Somme, but to break the stalemate of the war. Obviously, on the screen, this is a far fetch from anything we know modern day as a tank. Giant tractor wheels that go all the way around the thing, no turret. Instead, on the side, this thing has what's called sponsons. The sponsons are these big boxes. They house most of the guns on the tank. And there's one on both sides. Tanks in development were obviously massively secret. Almost no one really knew about them, and the word tank actually comes from secrecy. It was put out in most of any. What the word tank originally was for was to disguise its actual meaning and claim that it was a mobile water carrying system, like a water tank. So it was called the tank. After the battle, the public knew about tanks. They didn't know too much about them. They were very misconstrued ideas about it. They thought that they were massive land ships, such as like an entire water-based battleship on the land, or giant fortresses that moved slowly across the earth. Commonly, they at the time they did gain the name land ship because, well, kind of represents a boat in the ocean, I guess. And it was basically modeled after the armor on a boat to be put on land and moved around. The 1st Tank Battalion, or platoon, was called the Machine Gun Corps, again, to disguise what the actual meaning of tank was. And training started as soon as the first Mark I tank was received, and it was done in mass secrecy. On the right here, you can see the relative size of this thing. This is huge. It is very large. However, it's cramped. On the inside, it is cramped as all can be. There is almost no room to move around in that thing. In the photo, the troops are just mostly resting around it. It looks like this one is damaged or destroyed as it's pushed up against a hill, and it might not be able to move around anymore. British tank crews would come to wear this contraption. Basically, just a big leather helmet and this face mask. The face mask was less common, but the helmet was more so issued much more frequently. Not everyone received one, however, they were around. The helmet mostly protected if the tank were to get hit by something or were to hit something itself and abruptly jerk the crew around, and the wearer would hit his head and it would protect him because he's wearing this big leather helmet. And unlike normal helmets that you'll see outside of a tank, the big old metal helmets we were talking about recently, you don't need to be protected from falling debris or rocks falling from the sky quite like you would in a tank because you're in a giant metal housing. So all they needed really was a leather helmet to slow down their head if they get hit or if they get jerked around and hit something. It doesn't need to be some huge metal contraption. This mask on the front is for something entirely different, though, and this is a French uh, tanker who looks like he's put it on with a normal Adrian helmet. This mask is for what is called spalling, and spalling is on the right hand side, top right hand side here, big red outline for you. When a bullet hits a tank, a normal rifle bullet, it's not going to go through the tank. It's going to be stopped. However, most of its force is still going to be put into the metal, and it's going to throw fragments around in the tank. These face masks were made to protect the wearer from being blinded, cut, hit with shrapnel from the spalling, and were not very common. It was more so harder to wear them because obviously they've got these tiny vision slits that you can't see through, and they were more cumbersome than worth it in most soldiers' eyes. Most of the time in a tank, you were safe anyway. Bullets wouldn't get through. Most of the time, spalling wouldn't happen. Again, most of the time. Now, this is a Challenger 2. This is a modern British tank that they use nowadays. There are some huge differences in this and this. Obviously, the biggest one you might see off the bat is that this thing is much shorter. It's much shorter and has a giant turret on the top. The armor on this thing is going to be much harder to penetrate as well, and you won't end up with that spalling effect as much. As for the Mark I, as it was called in 1916, it had a crew of 8 and weighed 31.4 tons. which is relatively heavy. So these things would have a hard time moving around, especially in the mud, because they could sink pretty deep. The tank, again, was armed on these sponsons. The sponsons would house each a 6-pounder artillery piece, basically, that would fire high explosive rounds. The tank also would sport 3 machine guns, one on each sponson, and one directly in the front that you can't see right now because it is being blocked by one of the tracks. Now, in the tanks, too, there's more than just the issue of being shot at. The tanks didn't have a very good ventilation system, so most of the time, if there was an engine problem or you were in the tank long enough, you would start getting sick, throwing up, and maybe even hallucinating from breathing in so many fumes from the tank engine. This would slowly be fixed over the war in the coming years after the war as they were this British tank crews would come to wear this contraption. Basically just a big leather helmet and this face mask. The face mask was less common, but the helmet was more so issued much more frequently. Not everyone received one, however, they were around. The helmet mostly protected if the tank were to get hit by something or were to hit something itself and abruptly jerk the crew around, and the wearer would hit his head and it would protect him because he's wearing this big leather helmet. This mask on the front is for something entirely different, though, and this is a French uh, tanker who looks like he's put it on with a normal Adrian helmet. This mask is for what is called spalling, and spalling is on the right hand side, top right hand side here, big red outline for you. When a bullet hits a tank, a normal rifle bullet, it's not going to go through the tank. It's going to be stopped. However, most of its force is still going to be put into the metal, and it's going to throw fragments around in the tank. The face mask was made so that you didn't have to, so that your face could be. The face mask was made so that your face could be protected against these. These fragments would fly all over, and obviously you want to protect your face from being blinded or cut. These face masks were made to protect the wearer from being blinded, cut, hit with shrapnel from the spalling, and were not very common. It was more so harder to wear them because obviously they've got these tiny vision slits that you can't see through, and they were more cumbersome than worth it in most soldiers' eyes. Most of the time in a tank, you were safe anyway. Bullets wouldn't get through. Most of the time, spalling wouldn't happen. Again, most of the time. Now, this is a Challenger 2. This is a modern British tank that they use nowadays. There are some huge differences in this and this. Obviously, the biggest one you might see off the bat is that this thing is much shorter. It's much shorter and has a giant turret on the top. The armor on this thing is going to be much harder to penetrate as well, and you won't end up with that spalling effect as much. As for the Mark I, as it was called in 1916, it had a crew of 8 and weighed 31.4 tons, which is relatively heavy. So these things would have a hard time moving around, especially in the mud, because they could sink pretty deep. The tank, again, was armed on these sponsons. The sponsons would house each a 6-pounder artillery piece, basically, that would fire high explosive rounds. The tank also would sport 3 machine guns, one on each sponson, and one directly in the front that you can't see right now because it is being blocked by one of the tracks. Now, in the tanks, too, there's more than just the issue of being shot at. The tanks didn't have a very good ventilation system, So most of the time, if there was an engine problem or you were in the tank long enough, you would start getting sick, throwing up, and maybe even hallucinating from breathing in so many fumes from the tank engine. This issue would be fixed slowly throughout the end of the war and very much so after the war. Tanks would go through many, many changes after the war and become more so similar to what we know today. A lot of advancements were made by Germans in tandem with the Russians, and every country would come to adopt tanks. The Battle of Flers-Courcelette. The Battle of Flers-Courcelette was the first uh, engagement of tanks. This giant drive wheel at the back that you can see is supposed to help the tank with steering. It acted like a rudder on a boat and would kind of turn the tank a little bit. However, most of the turning was done by braking the right or the left tread. If you broke the left tread, as in like pressing on a brake in a car, it would turn the tank to the left. But they added this rudder at the back because they thought it would work, and well, it was subpar. It didn't work and would slowly fall out of favor. Now, tanks were a huge morale booster for the British. Because just imagine you're walking through a field and you've got this giant piece of basically armor. You have a fortress in front of you and you can safely walk behind it. And it's got machine guns and guns just bustling out of it to be able to combat the enemy. Now, with tanks, there were two different kinds. What you see here is a mail tank, and you can tell because it has a giant 6-pounder gun in it. Now, the female tanks, as you will see here, you can, if you look closely, you will see on the sponson it has two smaller turrets. The female tanks were armed with only machine guns and were meant to protect the male tanks. This one here has obviously been knocked out somehow. The Germans were terrified. Just imagine you're sitting in a German trench and you hear this loud rumble, and it sounds like engines are car engines in the distance, and it's slowly getting louder. And you peek over your trench, and you see this giant metal box moving towards you, and it starts shooting. And eventually, it's going to reach the trench, and it's got these giant long treads on it so that it can go over the trench. And it's just going to go right over your trench and keep advancing. There's nothing you can do against this thing. You can shoot it all you want. You're only going to have minimal success. Eventually, obviously, anti-tank methods. Eventually, obviously, more productive anti-tank methods were designed. The Germans would develop what is called a K bullet, which is just a bullet with a really thick steel core to it, so it could go through tank armor easier. And obviously, you can use artillery against these things pretty effectively. The Germans, of course, had to make their own. This wouldn't see use until 1918, though. It took them 2 years to develop this and put it out, and it was really quite terrible. To put it shortly, it was terrible. This is the German A7V. It weighed 33 tons, just a little bit more than the British one, so it's not too much worse. However, the biggest difference you'll notice is you're not going to really notice the tracks off the bat. They're mostly covered by the tank. On the British one, it's got these large tracks that go all the way around the tank that you can see. And that's going to help it traverse the land more. With this one, it's going to get stuck. It's going to run the ground easier. It's got this giant metal piece in front that's just going to hit stumps and stuff. It's not going to clear the land at all. It's going to have a hard time pushing things under it. And this one only had one gun. It had one 57mm cannon. And that was all it had, just right there at the front. You can see it. And, however, it was armed with 6 machine guns to support it. So it was more armored in so it was more armed in terms of machine gun and anti-infantry power, but only had the one gun. Again, this one doesn't have a turret. It looks like that at type at the, again, this one doesn't have a turret. It looks like that might be at the top, but that's just viewports for the commander and driver. Now, the last tank we looked at, the British one, the British Mark 1, had a crew of 8. This German tank has a crew of 18. They would fit 18 men into this tank. And right here is a diagram, just a cross, just a cut cross. And here is a diagram of this. This is just a cross cut of the tank, and this isn't even all that would fit into it. That front gun would take 2 or 3 men to run, so you can add another few there. There's another 2 machine guns on the side that we are looking at that you can't see because they've removed them. But this thing would just be cramped, cramped, cramped. And it just didn't work as well as the British one, frankly. Now, in the end, the death totals would come to about 200,000 French, about 420,000 British, and 335,688 Germans. I'm not sure why that number is so certain, but everywhere I looked, it was a very certain number, and the Allied ones were much more rounded. This photo here is wounded men that are waiting to be taken to a clearing station, which is where they would their wounds would be evaluated, and they'd say, "Okay, you can go. Okay, you got to go back into surgery," that kind of thing. Now, this is almost 1 million people. You've almost wiped out 1 million people in the matter of 140 days. 58,000 on the first day, nearly. And all this is for 6 miles. In this entire battle, the British and the French only made it 6 miles. And it's this dotted red line at the back that it ends up at. It's this the hard red line in the front on the far left is where we started, and the dotted one at the back is where we ended. Only 6 miles. And it was considered a massive success. And that's how most of the battles in World War I would go. You'd only make it a few miles, but they were considered massive successes. It really became a war of attrition. Now, this is what the Somme looks like today. We've got these. You can still see that where this is a trench line, obviously, and it's still there. It's just cut into the landscape. It's a scar that will forever be left on that area. These are shells, unexploded artillery shells that were unused, presumably in the battle. Obviously, they're unused. These are unused artillery shells that were found by a farmer on his property near the Somme. And this plagues most of Europe. In all of the years that Europe has seen, countless wars, there's always ordnance left behind nowadays, and it's always explosive. So if you ever take a trip to Europe, make sure you don't step on one of these and blow up. Here's an area photograph of presumably a trench system and shell holes near it. And the entire landscape is just pockmarked like this. But it's almost beautiful to see how nature's reclaimed it. It's all grass again, but there's no trees. There's not a tree here at all. It's mostly moss. Here are my sources. This first one was mostly just for tanks and British intelligence. It's a really good book, actually. It talks about how much the British knew about the German tanks and how much the Germans knew about the British tanks. This second one is about a British nurse on the first day of the battle. It's also a really good read. I would recommend it. This third one was used mostly for photos, and the last one was used for information on tanks as well. This top one, from Forgotten Weapons, this is an amazing source for anyone. I would highly recommend it if you are interested in any weapon history or uniform history or anything. Ian McCollum is the guy. He hosts a blog. This top one is an amazing source as well. It's an amazing, amazing place if you want to learn anything about weapons or third time's charm, right? This top one I used for the section on the equipment, and this is an honestly amazing source. I love this place. It's a large blog post about weapons and other forms of warfare that have been lost to history. And it's hosted by a guy named Ian McCollum, who also has a YouTube channel that they run daily, mostly making videos on weapons so that they're not lost in history. This third one was mostly photos and some basic information. It's a whole photos website. It's pretty cool if you want to see photos you don't see on covers of magazines everywhere whenever someone talks about any war. And this last one was used for information and images on the German A7V. That is my presentation. Thank you so much for watching, and I am looking forward to looking at everyone else's and seeing the response I get on mine. Have a great night, and I will see you all Monday morning.